Welcome back. In September of 2019, California became the first state to pass a law that allowed college athletes to be paid for their own name, image, and likeness, essentially to make money off of that. NIL became shorthand for many a college sports fan. And nearly 2 years ago, the Supreme Court ruled 9-0 against the NCAA, deciding restrictions on, quote, education-related benefits violated antitrust law. And it has transformed college sports ever since. We now have a patchwork of state laws creating chaos for 1,100 member institutions and 500,000 student athletes. The question is whether Congress will intervene and when. And now, perhaps reluctantly, the NCAA is actually wanting Congress to act. This week, the House subcommittee held its first congressional hearing on college sports and this issue of compensation. It was the first hearing that they'd held in nearly 2 years. Joining me now is the new president of the NCAA. And he's not a university president. They hired the former Republican governor of Massachusetts, Charlie Baker, to do this tricky job these days. He joins us from Houston, where sadly for me, UConn defeated the University of Miami last night, setting up the Huskies to play San Diego State, which advanced to their first ever NCAA final on Monday night after a thrilling buzzer beater victory over Florida Atlantic. Governor Baker, welcome to Meet the Press.
Morning, Chuck. How are you?
I am good. So let me start with that hearing with Congress, this issue with name, image, and likeness, and this patchwork of state laws. What exactly do you want Congress to do here? I know normally you wouldn't want intervention, but given what's going on, what is it that you're hoping Congress does?
Well, I think you pointed out the intervention issues associated with states sort of going in a variety of different directions, the pressure that puts on conferences and schools, because we do want to have sort of what I would describe as competitive equity here, a level playing field. And I think Congress has a chance to do what I would describe as consumer protections here. One athletic director, I think, put it pretty well when they said that the only thing that's true right now about NIL is that everybody lies. And that puts families and student athletes and schools and coaches and athletic departments and everybody else in a place where they don't know actually what the market is. And I think we should have a public registry of NIL deals. I think we should have what I would describe as financial literacy opportunities for families and student athletes, a certification process for agents, and a uniform standard contract. And these are all things we've talked to folks in Congress about, and I was thrilled to see them have a hearing on this.
You know, the professional leagues essentially have players' associations which do everything you're describing. They register agents. There is some transparency. There is some rules to the road. So would that be a better way to go about this, collectively bargaining with student athletes?
Well, keep in mind that you have 500, as you point out, you have 520,000 student athletes. The vast majority of them participate in programming at most of our 1,100 schools that is really what I would describe as the traditional way people think about college athletics, which is it's just part of the college experience and it's a chance for people to grow and develop and sort of find their teammates and learn a lot about accountability and discipline. That environment is not the one that would make the most sense for something like that. And in fact, the student athlete who spoke at that hearing, Kaylee Mudge, who's a softball player from Florida State, made pretty clear that she didn't think turning them all into employees was a good idea. And she also said something that's really important, which is this is something we need to get right.
Let me play something Charles Barkley said on 60 Minutes last week. I'm sure you saw this, but let me play it for the audience.
It's a travesty and a disgrace. I'm so mad now how we can mess up something that's so beautiful. In the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to have 25 schools that's going to dominate the sports because they can afford players. And these schools who can't afford or won't pay players are going to be irrelevant.
Governor, I'll make a confession. I'm a huge University of Miami fan. I love that football program. And I'm sitting here as a fan. I want to make sure, oh, gosh, there's going to be haves and have-nots. I hope my team's on the haves. And then you look back and go, whoa, wait a minute. We're going to have just what Barkley describes. 2 major conferences. They'll control all the sports. And everybody else looks like a club sport or D3. Is that where we're headed?
Well, first of all, you just commented about the fact that this is the weekend of the Final Four in men's and women's basketball. First time ever, no number 1, number 2, or number 3 seed made it to the Final Four. I think maybe in some respects people need to sit back a little bit and take a look at what's really going on out there. And I love Charles Barkley as much as everybody else does. I think in some ways the demonstrated competitive equity that we saw in the basketball tournaments on both the men's and the women's side was a big statement about the fact that there are a lot of terrific athletes out there in a whole variety of ways that they can be supported. And I think NIL plays a big role in that, if we get it right.
Yeah, ironically, NIL and the transfer portal, which some people have said has been terrible for college sports, isn't it the reason why college basketball is so competitive?
It's a big part of it. And the other thing I would say about the transfer portal, we should remember that if you look at the number of kids, I think in some respects because of the COVID pandemic, who've been transferring who aren't athletes, those numbers are also up dramatically. I mean, in some respects, what's going on with kids in sports in the transfer portal on the athletic side is in some ways a reflection of what's going on with kids in college generally coming out of the pandemic. And I think people should keep that in mind.
We addressed this earlier sort of on an aside, but directly. What do you believe the impact would be if California passes a law that says student athletes are employees of universities, you know, student athletes in Division I programs? What do you believe that would mean to Division I sports?
Well, first of all, we should all be careful about getting too far ahead of ourselves with hypotheticals. But what I would say is I've talked to a lot of schools about this, and the big message you get from most of them is, and this is true, I mean, everybody pays attention to the big-time sports that they see on TV, but the vast majority of college sports don't look like that. And at most schools, the athletic program actually costs them money. They don't make money on sports, and they offer it because it's a big piece of how they provide an experience for their student athletes. I think many people have done the analysis, and they've basically said it would be very hard for them to maintain the current programming they have. A lot of the sports that they offer would probably either have to go club or go away. And I don't think these are idle threats based on the conversations I've had with school leaders and administrators.
This has been a banner couple of years for women's college sports. We've seen huge ratings in the NCAA women's tournament. Caitlin Clark is arguably the most famous basketball player right now in either tournament, men or women. And yet the women's, you do not put the women's tournament up as a separate media rights deal. Is that going to change? The last deal sort of lumped it in with every other NCAA sport that wasn't football. Are you going to separate out the women and show the real value of the women's tournament financially?
I think the women's tournament this year has been sensational, both in terms of the viewership, but also in terms of the quality of the play. And you had last year's Player of the Year in Aaliyah Boston, and this year's Player of the Year, Caitlin Clark, face off against each other in the most watched game in NCAA history in a semifinal, which was just terrific. I think this is definitely something that's on our radar. The program, I think, is at exactly the right time, peaking here because the contract is up. We do have an opportunity to put it out separately. And we're going to work really hard to make sure that those student athletes, those schools, those programs get what I would describe as what they should get.
Governor Baker, I would say, do you miss politics? But you haven't left politics. You just have another arena where there's politics. Do you miss partisan elective politics?
Look, I've always been what I would describe as a moderate, and I wear that label proudly. I think the politics in higher education I would describe as politics to some extent, with maybe with a small p because they're not quite as partisan. But instead, what you really have is the same kind of big distributed decision-making model that I've been dealing with for a big part of my professional career, and I'm okay with that. I don't think there's anything wrong with having processes that require you to collect a lot of input and deal with a lot of different points of view and opinions. Yeah. But at the end of the day, you got to move as quickly as the context is moving, and you got to make decisions. And that, I think, is something that we need to be much better at.
Well, the bottom line is you have this job at perhaps the most consequential time in the history of the NCAA. Governor Charlie Baker, thank you for coming on and sharing your perspective with us.
Thanks, Chuck. Thanks, Chuck. Appreciate it.
You got it.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.